kind of world that our ancestors envisioned for us. And so we're people of struggle. We are peoples of struggle, and we're connected through that. And intellectual work means understanding that our work in intellectual spaces, in K-12 spaces, in university spaces, and in everywhere else where we try to develop our minds is part of our liberation struggle. It is not separate from, it is not meant to kind of isolate us from, it's not meant to make us special or exceptional or different. It's meant to kind of develop tools that will lead to the liberation of our people and of all people throughout the world. So that's where I'm coming from, is from a space of an intellectual space and wanting to use intellectualism as a tool of liberation. So I was asked to speak about privatization and why public education is so important. So I wanted to begin just by talking about why privatization efforts are so dangerous and what they're really about. And so I think that we see it everywhere, but we see it especially in the educational system and increasing rates. And what is that about? Richard Delgado writes about kind of the system that's set up, this white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system that's set up. And he says that it's set up for a particular reason, or for two particular reasons. And it's to allow the existing power structure, those who hold power, to gain two kinds of benefits. One of them material, and the second of them psychic. So when we think about the material benefits that are derived from the privatization of education, we can think about how corporations are really diverting public resources to enrich themselves. And so that's really obvious. There are these material resources that are diverted away from the public, right? Let's be real clear. The money that's meant for education is our money. This is our money. We pay into this system. And so when we privatize education, what we're doing is taking a public good and giving it to private corporations, right? But the second piece that Delgado talks about, the psychic benefits that white supremacist patriarchal capitalism derives from this process, is about programming. It's really about limiting our power. It's about kind of diverting us away from the truth of who we are, diverting us away from our authentic selves, right? Because if we have a public education that's truly collectively owned, then we develop an educational process where we are developing our intellectual tools as a part of the struggle for liberation. And that's a threat to the existing system. So I want to begin by talking about, or I want to present the struggle for ethnic studies at Cal State LA and throughout the state of California and throughout this country as an example of what public education can be and what public education is really meant to be. So I think most of you know, I hope most of you know, that the struggle for ethnic studies began with the liberation struggles, that it came out of the struggles of the 1960s and 70s, right? It came out of the Black Power movement and the Chicano Power movement. And when we think about what the demand for ethnic studies was, it was really about entrenching three things. One, making sure that in our intellectual process that we were truthful about the subjects that we're addressing, right? So I teach on a campus where we have an English department that has over 50 separate classes. So we have classes on all kinds of literature classes, all kinds of composition classes, 50 separate classes. 4 of them are on Shakespeare. 4 classes on Shakespeare. How many classes do you think we have on Chicano literature? None. How many classes do you think we have on Black literature? None. How many classes do you think we have on indigenous literature? None. Asian literature? None. What they do have is this one class where they push us, mush us all together, and we have one class on literatures of people of color, 4 classes on one white writer, and 1 class on all the people of color writers combined, talk about the truth, right? When we think about the history department on my campus, they have a couple of classes that qualify for diversity credit. One of those classes is comparative Greek and Roman society, because we don't learn enough about, Europeans, right? So the diversity class has to, again, be rooted in their stories rather than our stories. Now, let me put all of this in context. I teach at Cal State LA, not at San Diego State. And I'm making that distinction because Cal State LA, my comrade Steve Teixeira is here, we can tell you that Cal State LA is over 90% students of color. So on a campus where the student body is over 90% students of color, over 90% working class and poor people, right? We have an educational structure, we have a curriculum that's not constructed for our benefit and excludes us from the vast majority of it, right? So ethnic studies was built to correct that. That's one of the reasons ethnic studies was fought for. The second reason that ethnic studies was fought for is because the way that the mainstream corporatized model of education teaches is in a way that's very distant from its students, right? And I know we have lots of students here. Can you agree with me or reject that? Am I right?
Right.
Okay. So when we think about the way your educational process works, right? The mainstream corporatized model of education works. You're forced to memorize these things that have nothing to do with you, right? Am I right about that? Yeah. I remember that. So it's not on my notes, but I'm gonna give a quick aside. My oldest daughter is 11 years old. And she goes to a wonderful school in LAUSD. And she's always been an A student. She's really, really smart. She is now failing math for the first time. And when we talked about why she's failing math, she had this whole conversation with me, which was really flawed in a way, where she said, "Mama, that woman can't teach me nothing about math." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She just said, "I'm African." And I was like, "What?" And now this is kind of how you get yourself in trouble. She goes, "Didn't you teach me that African people invented math?" I said, "Yeah, tell me what." She said, "Well, my teacher is not African, so she can't teach me nothing about math." And so, of course, I don't want her to fail math, so I'm correcting her and going, "Well, you have to listen to what Miss Mack says, and she has something to teach you about math, otherwise you wouldn't be getting an F," right? But underneath, what she was really trying to say to me is the way that Miss Mack is teaching math. I didn't give you the school, so nobody go after Miss Mack, okay? But the way that Miss Mack was teaching her math it's not just about Miss Mack's identity as a white woman, right? It's about Miss Mack's approach, where she's distancing math from my child. She's creating this kind of division where you're doing these problems on a board and out of a book, and it doesn't resonate with who she is as a little black girl. And so for the first time, she's failing. What I learned this week is that this problem is not unique to Tandiwe. Every single black sixth grader in that school is also failing math. So when we think about what that means, what ethnic studies is about, and I'm not talking about ethnic studies when I give the math problem, or it might seem that way that when I'm talking about math class, I'm not talking about ethnic studies, but I am talking about ethnic studies. Because what ethnic studies is also grounded in is a pedagogy that says we need to address our students as whole and complete human beings who have something to give and something to present. And when Tandiwe is talking about African people invented math, and let's go back to ancient Kemet and understand the roots of geometry, because that's what she's learning is geometry, and let's kind of connect it to me, it helps her to excel in math because she feels like it belongs to her, right? And so that's what ethnic studies is about. The third thing that ethnic studies knowing, right? And so this corporatized model, this white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist model of education tells us that the way of knowing is for you to open your book, to read what they tell you to read, to listen to the teacher who's distant from you, and internalize that and regurgitate it back. We know that that is not the way in which we know. That's not the only way in which we learn. There's some things that we learn just because they're in us, right? There's something about spirit and soul that's a part of who we are, and that's true. It's true to learning. That's a true part. It's a valuable part of our educational process. So the third